Rachel, a young woman living in an old New York apartment, experiences an unsettling night when the power goes out. Sitting alone on her couch, lit only by her laptop's glow, the sudden silence of her surroundings amplifies every creak and shuffle from beyond her walls. She hears rattling from the door, quiet at first, but persistent. Her heartbeat quickens as she grabs her phone, her fingers trembling as she hits record. Peering through the peephole, she sees a shadow that seems to shift and block the faint hallway light. She feels a chill race down her spine and wonders if someone or something is lurking outside. Unable to bear the tension, Rachel steps into the hallway, where she hears soft whispers and an unsettling breathing sound. Panic grips her, and she retreats to her apartment, locking the door behind her. Now convinced that a spirit might be haunting the building, she questions whether this maintenance blackout is part of something far darker. The rumble of thunder drifts through the city, low and unsettling, resonating like a distant warning. Rachel pulls her blanket tighter around herself as she sits on the couch, curled up against the encroaching darkness. Each flash of lightning briefly lights up her apartment, casting harsh, unnatural shadows that seem to breathe and shift. Her phone, with its battery nearly drained, rests in her hand, her fingers clenched around it, as though it's the last secure thing she has in the world. The storm outside presses against her windows, making the familiar space feel smaller, more isolated. Shadows warp her belongings. Her coffee table becomes a jagged silhouette. The armchair's soft curves now seem sharp and ominous, and even the rows of books look like they're stretching into something unrecognizable. With every lightning flash, it's as though her own home is betraying her, twisting into something hostile. Rachel tries to distract herself, her gaze flickering from one shadow to another, but every tiny movement catches her attention. Her heart races with each creak of the floor, each rattle of the window. She knows it's probably just the storm. But what if it isn't? She shudders, remembering her childhood fear of the dark. It had never fully left her, and now, in the city, it had grown worse. The tall buildings around her felt like walls, keeping her trapped, her neighbors hidden away like strangers, mere voices behind walls. Here, if she screamed, who would hear her? As the power flickers, her dimly lit room becomes even darker. The candle on her coffee table casts only a frail, flickering light, leaving pockets of deep shadow in every corner. The apartment suddenly feels too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator and the distant noises of the building suddenly gone. Her phone screen glows for a moment before it too fades to black, leaving her utterly alone in the darkness. A shiver crawls up her spine as her mind reaches back to her grandmother's tales, stories she'd once brushed off as childhood folklore. Her grandmother used to warn her about spirits that lingered in forgotten places, waiting for the darkness to draw them out. She remembered the stories in fragments, how apparitions appeared in windows, shadows creeping along walls, spirits that watched in silence, waiting. Rachel laughs softly at herself, trying to shake off the fear. Those were just stories, she tells herself. Yet something in the room feels alive, watching. She stands, the blanket slipping to the floor as she reaches for the light switch, knowing it won't work, but still hoping for that familiar glow. She flips it on and off repeatedly, each click of the switch filling her with a sinking dread. Nothing, only the fragile candlelight that barely touches the corners of the room, where shadows seem to deepen, shifting as though they have weight and presence. A soft creak from the hallway outside makes her heart skip. She freezes, listening. It sounds like footsteps, faint but deliberate. Her breath catches as another creak follows, closer this time. Her mind races through a dozen explanations. It's just a neighbor, someone walking down the hall. But the silence that follows is thick, pressing in on her, filling the room with a tension she can feel in her bones. Her eyes drift to the thin line of light seeping in from under her door, a small sliver that feels both comforting and terrifying. It's a reminder of the outside world, yet now she almost wishes she couldn't see it. What if that light brings something with it? Her grandmother's voice echoes in her mind, tales of wandering spirits that drifted through corridors, searching for those who dared to notice them. The story of a girl who saw something in the dark once, and after that, she was never the same. Rachel had laughed it off back then, but now the memory gnaws at her, whispering warnings she tries to ignore. The quiet is shattered by a soft, hesitant rattling of her doorknob. Her breath hitches, and she clasps her hand over her mouth to stifle the sound. The rattle is faint, as if someone or something is gently testing the lock. Her pulse pounds, fear freezing her in place as she stares at the door, unable to tear her eyes away. She imagines the hallway outside, silent and dark. What could be out there? She considers calling for help, but the words die on her lips. The silence around her feels too thick, too charged. And then, something taps against the door, a soft but unmistakable knock. It's not frantic, not demanding, just a slow, patient tap, as if whoever is outside knows she's there. It sounds almost polite, yet there's a terrible purpose behind it, like a predator waiting for its prey to notice. Her mind races with the stories she once dismissed. She remembers her grandmother's tale about a woman who heard knocking at her door late at night and ignored it. In the morning, she found scratch marks on the wood, faint but real, as if someone had tried to claw their way in. Rachel swallows, her mouth dry as sand, and backs away from the door, each step feeling heavy and deliberate. Another knock, louder this time. She flinches, her hands trembling. She can feel the cold seeping into her bones, a chill that has nothing to do with the storm outside. Her instincts scream at her to run, but where would she go? The door is the only way out. She glances back at her phone, dead and useless on the couch, the small comfort it once offered now gone. Her candle's flame flickers violently, almost snuffing out, casting her face in brief moments of light and shadow. Just as she considers retreating to her bedroom, she hears a faint, almost inaudible whisper from beyond the door, like a voice carried on the wind. It's too soft to understand, but it chills her to the core. Her grandmother's warnings flood back in vivid detail. The importance of never acknowledging voices that call to you from the dark, of never inviting anything inside. Another rattle of the doorknob, this time firmer. The handle twists slightly, as though someone is trying to open it, and Rachel feels her chest tighten with panic. She's certain now there's something on the other side of the door, and it's not a neighbor, not a visitor. Her fear solidifies into a cold, unyielding certainty. Whatever is out there isn't human. The silence is shattered by a whisper, soft but clear, slipping through the door and into the room like a dark thread unraveling. Rachel. Her name, spoken slowly, deliberately, as though it's being tested. She gasps, backing away until she bumps into the coffee table, nearly knocking over the candle. The whisper lingers, hanging in the air, wrapping around her like a cold embrace. She doesn't recognize the voice, yet it feels intimate, too close, like it knows her. Rachel, it says again, a hint of something darker beneath the tone, almost playful. Her heart pounds as she stares at the door, terrified that it might open, that the thing outside might step into her home. She wants to run, but her legs feel like lead, her body unwilling to respond. The voice grows softer, retreating into silence, but the terror it leaves behind lingers. The room feels even colder now, the candle barely casting any warmth or light. She stands there, paralyzed, waiting for the next sound, the next whisper. Another soft creak, this one coming from behind her. She whirls around, her breath catching as she scans the shadows. Her grandmother's stories flood back, warning her that some spirits could enter even the safest of places if invited in by fear. She swallows hard, forcing herself to breathe, to steady herself, but the dread feels alive, pressing down on her from all sides. The sound of the doorknob rattling again pulls her attention back. She inches toward the door, unsure if she's driven by fear or some strange, dreadful curiosity. She knows she should keep her distance, but something draws her closer, like a moth to a flame. Her trembling hand reaches out, just inches from the doorknob, when she stops, frozen by a thought that roots her in place. What if it's waiting for her to open it? What if that's exactly what it wants? The storm rages on outside, the thunder masking any other sounds that might be creeping in the shadows. Rachel's hand drops to her side, her eyes locked on the door, her heart pounding as she waits, every nerve in her body on edge. She backs away slowly, step by step, until she finds herself in the corner of the room, feeling as small and vulnerable as she did when she was a child, hearing ghost stories in the dark. She doesn't know how long she stands there, wrapped in terror, watching the door and listening to the silence that stretches on like a dark, endless night. And as the candle finally flickers out, plunging her into total darkness, she feels the weight of something unseen settle around her, pressing in with a cold, unrelenting presence. The rattling stops. Silence fills the room, thick and oppressive, as if the air itself has frozen in place. Rachel stands motionless, staring at the door, her mind racing. A cold sweat clings to the back of her neck, but she forces herself to breathe. It's just a prank, she tells herself. Probably one of the neighborhood kids messing around, or maybe a stray animal clawing at the door. Her apartment is on the top floor, far from the street below, and the building is old creaky floors, leaky pipes, walls that groan with the weight of years. She'd grown used to it. In fact, the sounds of the building had become a sort of lullaby, a constant, comforting presence she'd come to ignore. But this rattling, this dragging sound feels different. A long, deliberate scrape follows, like nails dragging across the door. The sound grates against her eardrums, each drag stretching the seconds into eternity. Her breath catches in her throat, her feet frozen to the floor. She steps back instinctively, her eyes glued to the door as the scraping continues, louder now, almost as if it's mocking her. It's not a kid. It's too deliberate, too intentional to be anything so simple. Her pulse quickens. She recalls something her friend Sarah had told her a few months ago. Sarah had said a neighbor downstairs had complained about strange noises, footsteps at all hours of the night, doors opening and closing on their own. At first, Rachel had dismissed it as paranoia, one of those city oddities that everyone in a noisy, old building thinks they're experiencing. Nothing more than a case of overactive imagination. But now, as the scraping grows louder and more frantic, Rachel can't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something to those tales after all. The hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, and she feels an unexplainable chill crawl up her spine. The building is old, she reminds herself again, her rational mind attempting to wrestle control over the fear. Old buildings make noises. The wind, the plumbing, the wood settling. But even as she tells herself this, a sinking feeling presses in her chest, a gnawing sensation that something isn't right. This is more than just creaks and groans. And then the scraping stops. Just like that. A sudden, deafening silence falls over her apartment, as though the world has stopped spinning. Rachel stands still, her eyes wide, listening intently for any sign of movement. Her breath comes in shallow gasps, the adrenaline still pulsing through her veins. She can't tell if the silence is comforting or worse than the scraping noise itself. For a moment, she tells herself it's over. Whatever it was, it's gone now. But deep down, she knows it's not. Her heart pounds harder in her chest as her mind races through a dozen possibilities, none of them reassuring. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe there's a logical explanation. But the unease gnawing at her stomach tells her otherwise. Then, without warning, another sound breaks the silence, a slow, dragging noise again. But this time it's not coming from the door. This time, it's coming from inside her apartment. Rachel's stomach twists. She turns slowly, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room, the shadows stretching like fingers reaching out to touch her. The apartment feels suddenly smaller, the air thicker, as though the walls themselves are closing in on her. Her heartbeat is loud in her ears, and the hairs on her arms stand on end. Was it just the wind? Her mind desperately searches for an explanation, but the scraping sound continues, drawing closer, as though something or someone is slowly, deliberately moving through the apartment. Rachel's throat tightens, her breath shallow. She stands paralyzed, too afraid to move, but too terrified not to. In a moment of sheer panic, Rachel bolts toward the door, but she stops just before her hand touches the knob. Something tells her she can't just open the door. The world beyond that thin wood feels like a place she can no longer trust. She glances at the peephole, the small circular glass that has always been a small comfort, a barrier between her and the unknown. The hallway outside is dimly lit by the emergency lights, casting long shadows across the walls. Rachel leans closer to the peephole, trying to peer through, her breath fogging the glass as she strains her eyes to see. At first, there's nothing, just a dark, empty hallway, the faint outlines of her neighbor's doors lining either side. The silence presses in again, thick and suffocating. For a brief moment, Rachel allows herself to exhale. It's nothing, she tells herself, just her nerves. She pulls away from the door and turns to head back into the living room when she sees it. A shape. At first, it's just a shadow, faint and shifting in the dim light. But as it moves closer, Rachel's heart skips a beat. The figure is tall, almost impossibly so, and it seems to hover in place, as though it's not quite standing, not quite floating. Her breath catches again, and she freezes. It's standing right in front of her door. She can barely make out its form, the shape too blurred, too indistinct, but she can feel its presence. A cold weight presses against her chest, and she takes a step back, her mind reeling. There's no mistaking the feeling. It knows she's there. It's aware of her. And it's waiting. Her pulse races. She blinks, trying to clear the panic from her vision, but the shadow doesn't move. Instead, it tilts its head slightly, a slow, deliberate motion. Rachel's breath catches in her throat. Something about that movement feels wrong, unnatural. Her mind flashes back to a memory, distant and hazy, like a half-remembered dream. A shadow, a figure, at the foot of her bed when she was a child. Her grandmother had told her it was just a bad dream, but Rachel had always wondered if maybe it was something more. And now, standing there in her apartment, she feels it again, a sense of déjà vu, of something long buried rising to the surface. She steps back, her body trembling, and stumbles into the living room. The shadows stretch unnaturally around her, as if the darkness itself is alive. The candle on the table flickers wildly, casting twisted, elongated shapes on the walls. Her heart pounds in her ears, the thudding sound nearly drowning out the silence. She backs into the corner of the room, pressing herself against the cold wall, clutching her phone in her hand. Even though it's long dead, it's an empty gesture, but somehow it makes her feel slightly less alone, slightly more protected. She dares a glance at the door again. The figure is still there, still standing, watching her. Its head is tilted slightly to the side, and Rachel's stomach churns. It feels so familiar, but she can't place it. It's like the shadow of a memory, a whisper from a nightmare she can barely recall, a fragment of something that haunts her thoughts. The silence feels like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, and she struggles to breathe. What is it? What does it want? As the minutes drag on, time seems to stretch, each second stretching into eternity. The figure remains still, its silhouette an impenetrable void in the darkness. She feels its gaze burning into her, even though she can't see its eyes. It's waiting for something, and the thought makes her skin crawl. What if it's been here all along? What if it's never left her, never been far from her, lurking in the shadows of her life? The thought hits her like a cold wave, and a final, horrifying realization crashes over her. What if her grandmother's stories weren't just stories? What if they were warnings? Warnings about things that lived in the dark. Things that came when the lights went out, when the night fell heavy, and the world seemed to slip into madness. Rachel sinks to the floor, pressing her back against the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her breathing comes in short, ragged gasps. The figure at the door never moves. It remains in the same position, silent and still. But somehow, Rachel knows it's waiting for her to make a move, to do something. But what? She realizes, with a deep, visceral certainty, that whatever is out there, whatever is in the shadows, isn't going anywhere. And as the hours drag on, she sits frozen, too terrified to move, too terrified to close her eyes. The shadows seem to inch closer with every heartbeat. She can feel them drawing near, can sense their presence just beyond the edge of her vision. And in that moment, as she stares into the dark, she knows it has always been there. Always. Watching.